Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 21st, 2022. I'm going to be covering a series of topics that come up from in the aftermath of the Schiller Institute conference, in which there was a very serious effort to bring back the concept of reality, that you can try to decouple from reality all you want. And that's what the proliferation of narratives are all about, to give you an alternative view of the world so that it leaves you with a spinning head and an idea that there's nothing that can be done to change it. But you can fabricate narratives all you want, which is what the mass media run by the globalists are doing. And you can maybe even convince people to believe them. But ultimately, natural law intervenes, and the narratives are discredited by reality, and there's a golden moment in which change becomes possible. Because as the narratives collapse, people with the courage to admit that they had been manipulated or just plain wrong can then look around and say, well, who actually understood what was going on? You can discover what the truth was by application of Plato's Socratic method. Now, at the Schiller Institute conference, speaker after speaker exposed the disconnect from reality in this global narrative. And many of you already know that. More importantly, what we provided at the conference were the solutions, beginning with the takedown of the speculative system and the return to the economic policies that are based on the American system of physical economy that was developed and advanced by the work for 50 years of Lyndon LaRouche. So today I want to focus on the effects of the collapsing narrative, but at the same time, the still stubborn satanic insistence by the globalists that they can impose their will, that they can force nations to accept their perverted desire to impose a rules-based order, even as that rules-based order is collapsing. And I think you'll see from these examples that the narrative is collapsing very quickly. Now, first we begin with the upcoming NATO summit in Madrid that begins in 8 days. And this will be a push for a major escalation against Russia around Ukraine, and also for containing China by turning NATO into a global military alliance. There's discussion of adding Finland and Sweden. That will be on the agenda. The conference will be attended by South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, hardly part of the North Atlantic geography. And we've seen in the last days a new provocation where Lithuania, a NATO member, one of the Baltic states, is shutting off access to Russia, to Kaliningrad, which is the major port for Russia on the Baltic. It's the headquarters of the Russian Baltic Fleet. Now, Lithuania said they're doing this in conjunction with European Union sanctions against Russia, so therefore it's acceptable. But the Russians are calling it illegal and very serious, and they're saying that they may have to take some action to counter this. So once again, we see the effort to escalate the theater of war by NATO through the use of their eastward expansion over the last 30 years. Now, then we saw something completely absurd. After Macron, Scholz, and Draghi met with Zelensky in Kiev, even though they pledged publicly that they were going to continue support, there are rumors circulating that there was more to the discussion, that they may have been pushing Zelensky into a surrender. We don't know. We don't know for sure. But apparently Boris Johnson figured he'd better hightail it to Kiev as quickly as he could get there to reassert the insistence of the Western alliance that Ukraine fight to the last Ukrainian. Johnson had a surprise visit. He promised more weapons. He promised that the British would train Ukrainian troops, assuming there are still Ukrainian troops there. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where he described Ukraine as, quote, Putin's failure, unquote, despite evidence to the contrary. And he said the British will maintain full support for Ukraine until it wins the war. Now, while Johnson was in this flight forward, An even more shocking example of British arrogance came from the new Chief of Staff of the British Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders. In a speech to the troops, he said, "The British Army must be prepared, quote, to fight in Europe once again," unquote. "We must," he said, "forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle," unquote. Seriously, he's proposing the British Army go into Ukraine and fight the Russians. The reality is that for budgetary considerations and other concerns, the Brits are moving to reduce the size of their army from 82,000 to 72,500 within the next 3 years. This is hardly a fighting force, but the intention obviously is not just that the British will fight, but to try to bring the United States into a land war once again in Europe, as the British did twice in the last century. So this is where you see the narratives have dangerous implications if they're accepted. Now, at the same time this is going on, the British economy is collapsing. There's a rail strike in the United Kingdom for 3 days. There's a possibility that teachers and health service workers will join them in what could become the first general strike in years, as inflation is driving down real wages in the United Kingdom. Now then, let's look at France, what happened there with the parliamentary elections. Macron won a narrow victory in the first round of the presidential elections, and then in the runoff, he won again another less than smashing victory. But in the parliamentary elections, he lost his absolute majority in the parliament. You need 289 votes in the French parliament to have a majority. He only won 245 seats. Le Pen had to jump up to 89 seats. The leftist combined opposition won 142 seats. And with other parties, they now make up a majority. In fact, an anti-war sentiment in both left and right, so-called in France, offers the opportunity to pull France out of the NATO agreement for confrontation with Russia. And Jacques Cheminade, the LaRouche leader in France and former presidential candidate, put out a statement yesterday saying it's now time for France to leave NATO's integrated command. So this becomes an interesting situation to keep an eye on. Now then we have some developments on the war front. The Aidar neo-Nazi battalion, which along with the Azov battalion is one of the militias that were incorporated into the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the Aidar battalion surrendered in Lugansk in the last days. This is another blow to the ability of the Ukrainian military to fight in the Donbas region. There were cruise missile strikes where Russian cruise missiles hit depots that took out incoming howitzers and armored personnel carriers. Some of the new weapons that were being shipped into Ukraine, which were just obliterated on arrival. And a cruise missile hit a meeting of Ukrainian military commanders, and the initial reports are that 50 generals and officers were killed in the strike. Now, as to this question of Nazis in Ukraine, people who still poo-poo this should look at what just passed the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. De-Russification laws that include banning books by Russian authors that were written after 1991 unless the authors renounce Russia and become Ukrainian citizens. And secondly, banning the playing of Russian music on media and public transportation. This follows shortly after a decree by some of the top people in the education ministry and backed up by librarians that they would purge Russian books from libraries, possibly even burn them. Now, this is the freedom and democracy that we're supposed to be defending. This is the democratic world. Well, this is a perfect example of how narratives are destroyed by reality. And I think it's crucial that we learn the lesson now that these narratives are not powerful once the truth is put forward. And it's our job to get the truth out there. And that's what we did with the Schiller Institute conference. I'll have more on that conference tomorrow. You can see it at the schillerinstitute.com website, and I'll see you again tomorrow.